हम एक दूसरे की ताकत बनते और ये ही उनकी गलती होगी।
18 सालों के बाद भी क्या है जो आपको हौसला देता है?
मैं बस इतना चाहता हूँ कि हमारे साथ जो हुआ वो किसी और के साथ ना हो।
For the last few days, I've not been able to sleep properly. And the reason why that is because I saw a very powerful show on Netflix called Trial by Fire. And it is one of the most visually striking and most powerful shows I think Netflix has come up with since Delhi Crime. And I'm delighted to be joined by co-director Prashant Nair with me today. So huge welcome to you, Prashant, and thank you for joining me on Filme Shilmy.
Thank you for having me.
Now, just a quick viewer's discretion that this video will be discussing some very strong subjects which may be triggering. We'll be dealing with grief and everything around that area. So in case if you are distressed by that, you've been cautioned. Right. So, Prashant, the Uphaar Cinema 1997 tragedy was well reported in India, but yet not as globally known. So when was the moment you decided that this warranted a fictional retelling?
So the book came to me through Siddharth Jain and Namal, Shine India. They basically gave me the book in, I think, November 2019 it was, or somewhere around there. And I read it, and I was extremely moved by the account of these two parents. It's the series is loosely based on and inspired from the book that Mrs. Krishnamurthy wrote, the mother of the two children that passed away around whom the series is based on. So I was very moved by it. I was outraged by what happened, primarily because it didn't have to happen. If the right precautions had been put in place, the incident could have been avoided. So I was very moved by it. Mostly also by the resilience and the fortitude of this couple that, after having suffered such a devastating loss, they were able to kind of find the courage and fight for 25 years for what they believed in. And I thought that if, they could do this, if we could all find even just a fraction of that courage within ourselves, maybe things would be very different. So I felt it was a story that was important to share.
Mm-hmm. Now, I really find the combination of you and your co-director Randeep Jha very interesting, because you share the common ideal, I think, of narrating real stories which highlight systematic flaws within society.
Mm-hmm.
So what other factors connected you here? I mean, how important was it to find that equilibrium amidst you both?
Very, very important. I mean, when we were looking for a co-director, I wasn't really sure that we would find one because, a lot of times series suffer from, voices that aren't exactly the same, or, if schedules are divided improperly or illogically, then the overall, the series feels very disjointed. But I'd seen Randeep's work. He made a wonderful film called Halahal and a short film called Karta. And he's just, we started talking, and we really connected on, the movies that we loved and the style of cinema and the style of storytelling. And I think Randeep is a really sensitive, he used to be an actor. He's a really sensitive director, and he's really good with actors. And having been an actor, he knows sort of how to get the best out of them. And he also has this commitment to not sensationalizing things, to realism. So it felt like a perfect fit. And then the challenge was obviously how do we divide the work between us. So basically I focused on the Krishnamurthy's track, the final episode and the pilot, and the track with Anupam Kher and Ratna Pathak Shah and Rajesh Telang, and Randeep focused on the Kishan Pal track, the man who lost seven people in the fire, and Ashish Vidyarthi's track, and Shardul Balraj's track, and then we worked together with another director, Avani Deshpande, on the 6th episode, which was this kind of long take sequence that you've seen. So, and the crew remained the same, and I think that's also what helped a lot, is that the crew was really like a family, and when the director changed, the crew was the same, the DOP was the same, etc.
Right. I think I love the set design, and I think I like the way you recreated the 90s and that suffocating atmosphere. I don't know, there's something so foreboding about the 90s, even though I kind of grew up then. But now when I look back at certain incidents which have happened to so many other people, it makes me really think about that. But when it does come to, recreating this atmosphere and this setting, how important was the screenplay and setting the base for it? And how did that help in actually, you translating that on screen as well?
Well, the screenplay, it's really, the base on which everything is, so especially with something like this, where you're dealing with large chunks of time, where you're dealing with a conclusion that isn't really a conclusion, they're still fighting. Their victory is that they haven't accepted defeat, that they're still standing in the face of all this opposition. You had like kind of a justice should have been obvious and immediate for them. It shouldn't have taken 25 years. So one of the antagonists is really like inaction and stagnation and the rigidity of the judicial system. So all of this stuff, like had to be, treated in a way that was compelling in a series format, which isn't really obvious. So I think a lot of those challenges had to be really solid in the writing for the rest to kind of work. So that was a 9-month process with, I have a co-writer named Kevin Lupercio, who's based in LA. It's funny, we are very opposite. He's from a small town in New England. And I'm from India. He's, never been to India, but this kind of worked for us because, that having, an outside eye and really focusing on sort of what the characters were going through, helped us, I think in the end, nudge the show towards being something more universal. But yeah, the writing is key. I think it's the foundation on which everything else is built. So it's very fortunate that we were given the time and the freedom, by Netflix, by Endemol, to really not rush that part.
And I think you were talking about the villains and the antagonists. It's very interesting because we never actually got to see them uh
Yeah.
fully. There was like glances, there was like shots of them, maybe them walking in the office and people like clapping for them, but there was never an actual dialogue exchange where you perhaps would have expected to. So what was the idea behind that? Was it to uh intentionally communicate how these are just faceless powerful people that are having an impact on the ordinary person? Was that the whole idea behind not showing them fully?
Well, initially, actually, it was a legal constraint. We had two sets of lawyers who were like, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. And, by the time we ended up with it, we're like, well, if we can't show, the uncells in the show, how are we going to make this show? And we kind of almost gave up and we're like, we can't make the show like that. But then when we got to think about it, we thought, well, maybe there's a way we can use that. Exactly as you say, maybe. And in Mrs. Krishnamurthy's book, there's a line which talks about how they didn't really come to the court that often. They were represented by a battalion of lawyers. They were so powerful they didn't need to be there. And so we thought, okay, let's just go with it. And we went with it. And the absence of the antagonist in a way kind of creates this feeling that they're really so powerful that you can't even touch them. Despite 25 years, you can't get near them. And then we tried to kind of also, use shots of the city and all the different properties that they've created because they built Delhi's first high rise, Delhi's first shopping mall. They were at one time Asia's biggest or one of the biggest property developers. So their presence in Delhi is felt through the city. So we started to use all those things. And we used this image of the empty chairs, that are these two empty chairs. And then, when you finally do see them, you see the two empty chairs and they sit into it right before the verdict is announced. So that's an example of sometimes like a constraint that you think would make it, unworkable, actually helping the show.
Yeah, and I think speaking of constraint, I think I'm sure it must have been very worrisome for you and the entire makers because obviously obviously I'd heard that they had gone to the High Court to ban the show and to not show the show, but
Yes.
obviously thankfully it worked in your favor. At that point, I mean, not just as filmmakers, but as people, I mean, that must have been very, very scary. So how did you cope with that time, and what gave you that strength to, I guess, stay sane?
Well, I mean, from the beginning of the project, we had lots of lawyers involved, who were reading all the drafts and giving us feedback. But we felt confident because whatever we've included in the show, for the most part, is in public domain. We were very careful about that, like court documents in Mrs. Krishnamurthy's book. So we had, their government reports. We've been quite rigorous about sticking to the facts, in terms of how the case itself. But yeah, we obviously knew that, there would be resistance. So when, they filed in the High Court to block the show, we weren't really surprised. But it was tense. We'd worked so hard, and it was literally the night before the release. And thankfully, the Delhi High Court, I think, really, not only declined their petition, but also made a really touching statement about the importance of the tragedy and how the story deserves to be told, and how, it's a shame, that it happened, in a sense. So that was almost an endorsement. But yeah, it was pretty nerve-wracking. Whenever lawyer is involved, it's generally nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it means serious stuff. I think when you've got,
Yeah.
then again, I get the content that you are making. I mean, it is very intense. But I think focusing a bit more on the cinematic side, I really liked. I can't remember which episode. I think this was the villains episode of the show, and I really like the way you showcase the transition of time, where the camera is fixed at one particular point, but then the action of actors, whether they're coming out and going in, determine how time has elapsed, which I thought was very, very clever. So from where did you develop such filmmaking tropes?
Well, the thing is, in episode 6, what we do, the episode is called Villains. And I think we start to raise like big picture questions in that episode, like, okay, what happens if the Ansels are convicted? Will anything change? Who's guilty and why? And that story that you're referring to is very loosely inspired by the man who repaired the transformer that day, who ultimately got the largest. He served the most amount of time. So in a sense, he was a bit of a scapegoat because he was doing what he'd always done and following instructions. And he's the guy who served the biggest sentence. So we thought that was interesting, and we thought, okay, well, what if we revisit all the events? Because this man not only served the largest sentence, but he also had to live with this case looming over him and his family's head for 25 years, which is a huge amount of pressure. And, basically, I imagine his life was ruined. So we thought that was interesting, and we thought, okay, let's make that a story. And so then obviously time becomes very important, right? So our first decision was, let's not leave their house. Let's just stay in the house and let the camera never leave, and let's just follow these characters. And because we're talking about time and its effect on this family, let's make time very visible to the audience. So we were a little worried. We didn't want it to be too flashy and, look at all these filmmaking tricks, but we felt it was justified because we're talking about time. So then it became like, how do we do these long takes? And the DOP, Somyananda Sahi, who's a genius, basically devised these long takes on Steadicam, and then we built a whole set, and we had trapdoors, and so the actors would actually run out and change in the middle of the shot and come back in.
Wow.
And then of course there's VFX with the windows, and so it became something where all the departments kind of were involved. Like, how can you get an actor changed in 20 seconds? And these long takes of sometimes like 8-9 minutes uninterrupted. Really, really exciting and fun. Really great for the team and, to do. But we felt it was justified because we were talking about time as such and the effect of it. So yeah, that was sort of maybe one of the most fun parts to shoot.
It almost seems quite theatrical, actually. Like, I mean, but now that you describe it, that process, I mean, of course, as a viewer, like, it of course feels like a very wonderful visual trait. But I think in terms of the actual mechanics of it, it must have seemed like quite theatrical then, isn't it, in that sense?
Yeah, it was like a theater production. We had this sound stage, we built a set, the actors were changed, and there was a combination of VFX. There's all this crazy stuff that went into changing the lighting during the shot. So when it goes from day to night, we had to really be careful with the lighting as well, because the windows were all VFX, but the lighting had to be consistent with the inside, and so that was a whole trick. The makeup, the aging, sometimes within a shot, Yeah, so it was pretty crazy, but a lot of fun.
but yet so realistically done. Like it seemed as if this was a street that you'd be walking down in Delhi and you wouldn't even think twice that this is what's happening in their lives. And I think that was incredibly done, and I absolutely loved that sequence. I think when it comes to the actors, when it comes to your films or even Randeep's movies as well, whether it's Barun in Halahal, Suraj Sharma in America in your film, or even Arjun Mathur, who we were talking about in Made in Heaven, I
Yeah.
feel like you've always managed to bring out these very deep-rooted, heart-wrenching emotions within actors, and perhaps dimensions which you've not seen quite before in their careers. And I think that can be said for Rajshri and Abhay in Trial by Fire as well. When it comes to casting, and looking and scouting for talent, how essential is it for you as a filmmaker to not be carried away by the star power or by notable faces to sell your product? How do you get that fine tuning?
I mean, the for me, I try not to think about that at all. I try to never let that come into my decision making process. Obviously, the producers that they have a different say, so there's always a little bit of push and pull, and you arrive, at the right, um, you know, at the right person for each role. I can't think that way. I don't. I just think about it as in terms of who is the right, who am I excited to see in this, and also more importantly than that, who's willing to take the journey with us, because that's when you're talking about for example we talked about some of the scenes, like for example Arjun Mathur in Made in Heaven, confronting his father, or Rajshri on the phone hearing that her children are dead. Those scenes are incredibly difficult, and when you get a take that works, that's usually the starting point. So it's all about the actor and how much they're willing to give you, how vulnerable they're able to be with you, and how invested they are in the role. That regardless of whether it's a star or not. But once the actor is willing to give you that, then it becomes about creating an environment for them that's safe and quiet and calm and respectful, and letting them do their thing. And as I said, once you get a take that's working where you could actually stop, that's normally the place you begin. And you try to see, can we go deeper, can we go further, what happens if we hold this moment? And then for me as a director, it's about not letting things break that. Like if you yell cut, for example, someone will come and spray their face with the a refresh, and someone will adjust the light, and there's clanking, and like then there's a tray of snacks that come in, and you want to keep all that out. So for example, I don't cut. I just say, okay, everybody stay quiet, we're just going to go back to one, and we take it, so the actor can kind of build from that emotion. And they have to go to really difficult places for that. Like I don't know what those places are. I don't know where they go to get that, to tap that emotion. And I'll never know. Everybody goes to a different place. But so for me, it's just about figuring out, what does this actor need in order to be able to go there safely. And then they also need time to come out of it afterwards, because it's not like you can be like, okay, cut, let's go to the next shot. They need space and time to kind of come back from wherever they've gone. It's I'm truly in awe of actors and how they're able to do this. It's incredible, these deep primal emotions that nobody should ever have to go through, to conjure them up in front of 300 people with lights. It's incredible.
And I think this is one thing that I've always admired about actors too, is that they really do have to visit such dark places. And, I can't even imagine, it's very interesting how you said that you don't actually cut and you have that continuous, uh, flow of filmmaking, which I think really does help, I'm sure, because, sometimes to switch on and off and to go back to that becomes very difficult, I'm sure, because once they've
Absolutely.
wrapped up for the day, they probably want to forget about what they've done and, just continue with the day and trying to focus on the next assignment in that project. So I understand how that must be. But I think, look, one thing that I've always been very curious about is capturing grief. See, as human beings, when we emote, we don't think कि अब हमें रोना है, कि अब हमें रोना आ रहा है. या कुछ react करना है. It just happens very intrinsically. So do you feel like the heaviness of such a subject encroaches on in your mental health and your psyche as well? I mean, what helps a storyteller to depict grief on screen, and that too with that certain realistic approach again as well?
Um, I mean, in this particular case, um, I think what we're talking about was horrific. So basically, to the best of my knowledge, there's no word in any language for a parent that's lost a child. You have widow, you have widower, you have orphan, but there's no word for a parent that's lost a child because I think it's unimaginable. And I've checked in multiple languages, and there doesn't seem to be a word in any language I know of that has that word because it's just unimaginable. It's horrific. And this happened to like the real Neelam and Shaker. When this happened, their friends kind of slowly dropped away just because seeing them every day was kind of a reminder of this thing that should never ever happen. And I think a lot of us felt the same way because a lot of us are parents. My DOP has a son. I've got two daughters. The number of people in the crew have kids. So, and for us to go to work every day and kind of be like confronted with this was very tough. Very, very tough. I mean, me personally, I know that I've become a lot more scared about, my kids and like, whether it's crossing the road or whether they're alone somewhere or what, I've become a lot more worried. And I think a lot of people in the crew felt the same way. They had to, in the sound mix, for example, like the mixer had to take a break at some points because, he just, it's very heavy, and then if you're someone who feels, which every member of the crew was, I think it profoundly affects you. But at the same time, I think we all knew that this was an important story to tell, like in terms of what happened to Neelam and Shaker should not have happened to anyone. And it is happening to many people. There are 4.5 crore cases stuck in the judicial system. There's a building that collapses almost every day in Mumbai. There's structural collapses. So it's not something that, that's only happened to them. And so that feeling of like, we need to tell the story, we need to generate this discussions, debate was something that I think kept everyone going. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I was gonna literally say that. Do you also feel that because it is so overwhelming, the subject, and because it is very emotionally draining, does perhaps a more mechanical approach to filmmaking help in this instance, where you focus more on the technicalities of the camera, and obviously you look at the actors and you just perhaps be that instructor as a director, and perhaps give that tips that you're supposed to do. Does those sort of things come handy when you're dealing with a very sensitive subject here?
I think that never works because you can't do that as a filmmaker. I think speaking personally, the moment I know something is working is when I'm transformed for a moment into the audience, where I stop looking at it as a director. Then I know instinctually something is really working. Sorry. So no, I think you can't. There's no way of shying around it. You've got to be kind of looking for that and connecting with what's happening. You can't detach yourself from it, which is the hard part. Now, in terms of what you choose, you may conjure that up on set. What you choose to present to the audience in the edit and so on is a different matter. There may be moments like, for example, you want to cut out right before, like the title sequence in the pilot. She's on the phone, we hold, but then we cut off before her full reaction, and you do things like that in the edit for sure, to because the audience is smart, and they don't sometimes leading them up to the point and then letting them kind of take it from there is more effective than just kind of hammering it home.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the cinema fire scene in the last episode, I think that really, I mean, how much it's really given me sleepless nights, and I think many people watching this interview and who have seen the show, I'm sure it's probably the same for them as well. I think it was so, so gut-wrenching, especially with how we literally see a transition of a cinema that's literally hustling, bustling, everyone's excited to go watch Border, and then suddenly we see it ending up in flames. It becomes a crematorium. I think that was So, gosh, I can't even articulate it properly. But what assisted you to capture this moment so authentically? And how important were research and witness accounts for this? Because obviously you weren't there. So how does one create tragedy when a filmmaker was not necessarily present for that?
So so basically so first of all, we struggled a lot. Should we show this or should we not? Is it too much? Is it manipulative? Do we need it? Do we need to show it? There could have been a version of the show where we didn't show it, the fire. But the thing is, I felt like we needed to connect the audience in an emotional way to the outrage that the families of the victims would have had, and that's the only way to do it, would be to like show them what happened, because as much as you talk about it in the courtroom and all that, it isn't real until you've actually seen it. So the idea very quickly became like, let's go through the whole thing, let's see them fighting all these years, let's get to know everyone, all the various people involved, and then let's follow the children into the cinema that day. And along the way, because we see all these people that we've seen through the various episodes, we feel for them a little more. We're connected to them a little more. We know who they are, and they go into the cinema. So then our objective. So we felt this was the right thing to do. We didn't feel it was exploitative in terms of actually showing it. So we did a lot of we had a great team. Monica Bomik, who's the production designer. She had been, she grew up in Green Park area. She actually was on her terrace watching, the fire that day. And she'd been to the cinema many times. And so we went to the actual Uphaar cinema and we took measurements and we took photos. And then it's still there in Green Park in Delhi. It's like, because of a dispute, it's been left exactly as it is, this burnt out kind of husk in the middle of Delhi as a reminder of what happened. So we went there. We consulted a lot of photos. We must have interviewed at least 40 people who survived and got accounts. We got government reports, which were pretty accurate about what happened at what time. But then obviously, we had to recreate the whole thing in actually 4 sets. And this was all during the pandemic. So, it was really complicated. It was like 12 days. That sequence took 12 days. And we had 4 sets, one for the basement, one for the interiors, one for the exteriors. And we built a huge set. We had like cranes and fire trucks and 700-800 extras at a time, maybe more. We had explosions, fire, smoke machines. It was madness. And then all this, in COVID. So we had to do this with like testing and like it was really crazy. I think for us, the big challenge when we were doing all this was to, obviously you got the scale and of everything that's happened there, but to not lose track of the fact that this is about the people, the characters, to stay close to them, not to get carried away with all that mess, with like fire and smoke and all that, like, but to really stay close to our various characters to make sure you're still following them through the entire show. But yeah, it was pretty crazy actually when I think about it now.
Mm-hmm. And I know you've been very clear about, giving the voice to the people who unfortunately had suffered a lot in that fire, and obviously, unfortunately, many of them have passed away because of that. But as a director, because of the vision that you have, do you feel like you internalize and channelize perhaps a very ghastly and sad time in your life through a scene like this? And does that kind of help you perhaps sometimes?
I haven't, been close to a tragedy of that proportion or anything. So no, I don't think so. I think what helped me is just kind of staying close to the characters, each one, and thinking about from their perspective, and they all loved someone. They all had a reason to make it out. They all, you know, so and we knew their stories, we knew their lives. So by staying close to them, I think it helped us kind of, make, it gave us a way into the filmmaking, where we're just going to focus on, like, for example, this captain and what he's thinking and what he would do next, and so on. And there were a number of stories, for example, that we just touched on briefly, like the guy who with the mattresses.
Yeah.
That's a whole story, because this guy, for example, owned a shop near the Uphaar. He brought the mattresses to save people, and then he tried to get insurance for it later, and his claim got denied, and his store went out of business. And those two boys in the cinema, those are there's a whole story from them that we were only able to show snippets. There's the more we got into it, there were so many incredible stories of people whose lives had been touched by the fire in one way or the other. There were many heroes. There were many people who helped that day. There were many, we sadly couldn't include everyone and everything, but there's we scratched just the surface of it.
Mm-hmm. I know you touched upon it a bit earlier as well in your responses, but how has it changed you? In what way has, especially this sequence? Because I feel like, I mean, before watching the show, I feel, not to sound dramatic, but I feel like I've not been the same ever since I've seen that scene. It's like, I remember watching the Johar scene in Padmavat, and that really changed me a lot. And then seeing something like this where, willingly or unwillingly, a bunch of humans are forced to just die. They're forced to go into such a situation. How has that impacted you and perhaps the way you see life now?
I think the series is kind of so as I mentioned, it's made me kind of cling to my loved ones a little more, and to be a little more fearful of their well-being, and to I do look at safety stuff more when I walk into a place. I'm much more conscious of it. I am definitely much more passionate about like the reform of the judicial system being like an important and essential step for any kind of growth in India's future. So all that stuff, but I don't know. I mean, I think more than anything, it's just also made me grateful a little bit of what I have, and a little afraid, of the number of ways that, things can change in a matter of minutes, this is something I've spoken with the Krishnamurthys about at length. They who would have thought that day, when the kids left, she actually told me that, her daughter kissed her before leaving and left like a little lipstick mark on her cheek, and she wishes she hadn't kind of wiped it away so quickly because it was the last time. So I think that's something that really, really kind of, every moment is precious. And
not to quote Kal Ho Na Ho, but literally, I mean, I think that's definitely something which it definitely does. But I'll tell you one thing though, Prashant. It's very easy for a story on systematic and legal flaws to reflect badly on a country. I mean, the amount of anti-India films I've seen, in the guise of it being human interest ones, it appalls me sometimes when I have seen that. And I honestly, as an Indian myself, and as someone who is very proud to come from a country like that, I don't usually like to watch depictions which actually highlight India in a bad light, which I think Trial by Fire actually doesn't. And I think it's very real, and it really shows, because I've been to Delhi and I've seen that some of the attitudes that were there in the legal, in the offices and the administrations, is pretty much the same. And it's very sad that it's not changed since. But how did you balance the procedural aspects with the emotional ones and make sure that it doesn't do a dishonor on your roots and where you come from as well?
Yeah. Well, I in no way ever did anyone, me or anyone on the team, ever intend this to be like a commentary on India in general, and I've seen some reviews like that, and I don't think it's a comment on India or Indians as such. If anything, it speaks about the resilience of the everyday folks in India, who have to deal with this kind of inertia in the system. But it does shine a light on something that is going to be, it's something we have to solve, right? Like public safety and the right to a fair treatment in the courts are basic pillars of any functioning society. And India is growing incredibly fast, and a lot of stuff is changing, and a lot of things are improving. The future is very bright, but these two things need really to be urgently reformed if people are. And I think this is also why the show is resonating, is because I think people, despite it being so sad and it's so tragic, I think people are responding because everybody's had that experience in India of like being confronted with a system that you feel powerless and helpless against, and this is on a daily basis. and you either give up or you take shortcuts, or but very few people really stand up to it, like the Krishnamurthis. So if anything, I would say we made this as a reminder to people that you deserve these things. These are your rights, and if you can muster up a fraction of the courage that the Krishnamurtis have, and if we all can do that, then maybe that's how change happens, because change happens by showing up every day, no matter what, and that's what the Krishnamurtis did. So I feel like, if anything, it's a call to arms in a sense, and it's not at all a commentary on India as a nation or any government or anything like that. It's, it spans 25 years. There've been multiple, pretty much every, so there's no real political agenda there.
I mean, the reason why I say that, because as you know, there are already
Absolutely,
with
yeah.
political agendas trying really hard to derive, and I'm just like, for God's sake, leave us alone. हमें कामयाब होने दो भाई. कितने सालों independence के बाद हमें ये मौका मिला है. But no, I think definitely it does do a lot of. I think it does serve a lot of purpose that's beyond that, and it's definitely a very, very strong human interest story. I think, which is why everyone has related with the film, with the series, and I think with the content of what they're portraying. But I think if you think about it, Prashant, I mean, just looking at the trends of the industry right now, it seems like gritty and real stories are more popular now. Of course, we all love escapism, but it almost seems like escapism in the construct that we're used to in society is perhaps becoming more prevalent in the content that we see. Last year, if you think about it, films like Bhul Bhulaiya 2 did really well, Drishyam 2 did really well. And I kind of like to think that the audiences, even the Kashmir Files for that same matter as well, I feel like sentimentality and nostalgia seem to be very core themes, I think, in the films which have been doing well. Maybe that's due to the lockdown, I don't know. But do you feel that that perhaps, like you mentioned as well in your response, do you feel sentimentality and perhaps nostalgia as well has worked heavily as well in Trial by Fire's favor? Because obviously it is a very sentimental story, and it does take you back to the 90s and a cinema that we all have visited once in our lives as kids.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think before Trial released, possibly the fear was that, it might be too hard hitting, it might be too sad. Is the audience ready for that? It's a very unusual series. It's not a, the classic way of telling the story would have been to make it a courtroom drama, and it's really not about that. It's about the personal cost of, like, what it takes out of you when you have to seek justice. It's a story about these two people and their lives, in a sense, versus what's happening in the court. So I think there was a lot of, no one really knew how it would be received, because it doesn't rush to the finish line. It's quite slow paced. Tonally, it's sad and difficult. It changes tone. It takes very bold leaps. The ending is quite unusual. So it was a little different from a lot of the series out there. And I think we've been very heartened by the response, because both critics and audiences are really responding to it. And everyone is saying, yes, it's sad. Yes, it's very emotional. Most people are crying doing it, which I'm not sure how I feel about. But I think it just goes to show that audiences are ready for a variety of emotions. They want to be moved. Like, it isn't about sad or funny, or it's about emotion. Do I feel something when I'm watching that? And I think, yeah, I think audiences want that. They want to feel something when they watch things, and they're much more receptive than we think they are. So I mean, for us, we're really encouraged, because it means that more stories like this can be told. It means that filmmakers can hopefully be a little more adventurous and take a few more risks in the structure and the pacing and the style of the narrative, and not just kind of try to in this binge obsessed kind of culture make things that are like really fast from beginning to end. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I think definitely we are very surprised and happily surprised by how people are responding to it. If I read the tweets.
Yeah, it did come out of nowhere. I'm not going to lie, because when I saw the trailer, I remember I was in India and was reading stuff about it. I was just like, this looks really interesting. And someone had told me about it, actually, that they tried to watch it before they went to bed. And I'm just like, Yeah, I don't know how you could watch this series before bed. मेरी तो रातें ही मतलब मेरी तो गई थी आप तो मतलब कैसे सोने से पहले देख लिया. But it's pretty amazing. But yeah, no, I think it deserves as well. But I think going forward, Prashant, what sort of stories would you be keen on exploring next? Have you started working on your next as well now?
So I'm definitely quite excited about the series format. I think we've just scratched the surface of what you can do with a long format. There are a lot of like fun things you can do, and I'm excited to kind of explore that a little more. So I'm looking at doing, there are 2 or 3 series concepts that I have in mind, and most of them are set in India at the moment because I think it's just, I don't know, whenever I sit down to write, they're always set in India, even though I don't live in India and I've grown up most of my life outside of India. For storytellers, India is just such an amazing place. The canvas is so wide and inspiring. And so I've got 2 or 3 series that I'm writing, slowly developing. And I just got back home after the release, so I'll probably take a week or two to think about which one next. And but definitely I think it'll be a series.
Mm-hmm. And will it? I hope it won't be as intense as this one. Because I don't think मेरे से नहीं होगा फिर से.
No, no, no. No. I also, I have clear instructions from the wife, like, please, like the next one, but I think it's, you spend so much time on these things that it needs to be something worth exploring. I don't know if I can do something, just, very, although you never know. But so, definitely lighter for sure, I promise. And then, yeah.
Oh wow. Well, look, I mean, I'm definitely very, very intrigued to find out what that will be. I mean, I think when it's the lightheartedness that we saw in Trial by Fire and the little family moments that they had just before the fire broke out, and whether it is the intensity which the whole series was about, I think you managed to really uh, present both aspects in a very visceral manner, and I'm looking forward to seeing what more you have to offer. And I can't wait, but I do think Trial by Fire is gonna continue to make huge waves, and as it deserves to as well. So a huge congratulations to you and the entire team for this. And I think this really, really was a story that needed to be told to mainstream audiences. So thank you for doing that and giving us such a wonderful piece of cinema.
Thank you so much, Anuj, for having us, and for the kind words.
Oh, thank you, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Prashant. Thank you.
Bye.